This is the this is the part of the program meant to keep you awake. And so we hope that you will oblige after that very full lunch. I'm Peggy Steinfels, the co-director of the Fordham Center on Religion and Culture, normally in New York, but by special request have come to Washington just for one day. I was editor of Commonweal, and I've done lots of things, which in theory makes me okay for a moderator of a panel on immigration and the church and politics, etc. Our panelists all have very full bios in the folder, and you can read them there, but I will very briefly just tell you that this is Robert Royal at this end of the table. Is that that's the right end? Right, that's the right hand. Bob is the founder and president of the Faith and Reason Institute, the author, editor, publisher, and translator of too many books to mention, but they are in the bios, and you can check them out there. And Bob and I actually once managed to work together on the American Catholics in the Public Square project. John Thavis is the bureau chief of Catholic News Service in Rome and has traveled widely with two popes. Only two? Only two. Yeah, and is author of a couple of books on those very same popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Amy Sullivan is a contributing writer at Time magazine, has written widely on politics, religion, and culture, and she is the author of The Party Faithful, How and Why Democrats Are Closing the God Gap. That was in September 2008. We'll see how that goes. And then at the end of the table, Frank Sherry is the executive director of America's Voice, an advocacy group that he founded in 2008 to fight for immigration reform. And as you see from his bio, he has spent, I would guess, most of his adult career on this subject. Good. Okay, our plan is for each of the panelists to make a very short presentation, 3 or 4 minutes, talking about immigration from their perspective and from their professional work, and or I suppose what they hear in the neighborhood too. So I think we will start with Frank and just move in this direction, and then I hope the panelists will have discussion among themselves, and there being time, we will turn to your questions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Very good. So I guess I'm the fellow advocate on the panel, since I've been working with the Catholic Church for, 30 years. It started with resettlement of refugees from Southeast Asia to helping the Cubans who came from the port of Mariel in the early 1980s, to Haitians, to Central Americans, to migrants, to refugees from all over the world. And I've seen the Catholic Church operating at all levels, from the parish to the Catholic Charities, to the diocese, to the Migration and Refugee Services, to CRS, to ICMC, and it's really quite impressive. So at the risk of sounding like a suck-up, I'm going to say that I think the Catholic Church should be very proud of its work on behalf of migrants and refugees in the United States and around the world. I think in the United States, where I'm most familiar with the work of the Church, it's one of the largest, if not the largest, service provider to refugees and migrants. I'm sure it's the largest. Not only through the Catholic Charities network, but through the incredible clinic network that Don Kerwin, my friend here, had such a big role in helping to establish around the country. Just awesome. There was such a gap in provision of legal services to immigrants, since the government wouldn't allow it to happen with legal aid offices, and that clinic has stepped up and created a sort of a mini movement. That's still not enough to meet the need, but for low-income immigrants, it's been literally a lifesaver. And then MRS. I mean, I work daily with Kevin Appleby and the incredible staff and the folks who have led MRS over the years, including my mentor and sometimes tormentor, Bishop DiMarzio of Brooklyn. He's occasionally criticized me, and he was always right about it. I'm so sorry to point that out. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church has been awesome advocacy. I mean, when I've been on the Hill doing lobbying work, the most common thing that I hear, especially as we approach a vote, is a staff person will come up to me and whisper, "Could you get the bishop to give him a call? Could the cardinal place a call?" Because of the moral voice that the church speaks with, which gives it its political influence. And so it's been a remarkable thing to see. I just have to talk about people like Bishop Wensky and the work that he's done over the years. Think of what Cardinal Mahoney did when the Sensenbrenner bill passed in the mid-90s. In 2005, December 2005. And he literally threatens mass civil disobedience if Congress enacted a law that would have gotten between the church and migrants that they helped. One of the most remarkable political events I've witnessed in my 30 years, and I still believe is the turning point in the debate when we finally do pass major reform and have the breakthrough that gives dignity and legal status to millions of people who are here working hard and building their families. I think we'll look back at Cardinal Mahoney's bravery as one of the things that helped turn the tide. That's the good news. So the question that we've been asked to address is, what can the church do? I'm all for educating the people in the pews. I spend most of my time trying to educate those same people. I also know how hard it is. So we can talk a lot about that. I can talk for hours about that. I think the bishops and the cardinals have done an amazing job. I love those articles that come out in some place where immigrants are not very popular, and the bishop has sent a letter to the entire flock saying, "Stand up for immigrants." And I'm just imagining how the switchboard is lit up that day, and the letters roll in, the donors call up, the meetings that are held. But that's the prophetic voice of the church standing up even when it's unpopular for a cause that many people just don't have a good understanding of, and other people are angry, sometimes justifiably, sometimes perhaps excessively. So, but I think that the kinds of work that you see in Justice for Immigrants, the kind of investment in local organizing may be where, and I know it's hard to do, I know it's hard to invest in, the relationship with PICO, I see Jesse here. I mean, that kind of work, as painstaking as it is and as hard as it is to resource, I think may be where the real future lies, because it's the people that are getting most mobilized, I think, whose voice will ultimately create the political space for a breakthrough.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll hear more about that. Amy.
Whenever I'm speaking to Catholic audiences, I feel like I have an obligation to disclose that despite my last name and to my father's continuing dismay, I am not Catholic. I'm actually a Baptist Sullivan. So I'm here as an outsider, as a Time reporter who covers religion and politics, but I'm also here as an outsider from the church. So I was never going to use my time here to speak to what the church should do on immigration. I think the case has already been made in previous sessions today about a moral case for the church's involvement in immigration, and a moral case in terms of what that involvement should be. What I would like to talk about is kind of the practical possibilities of getting to that point, and reaching maybe what Cardinal McCarrick was speaking about in terms of the consciences of those who are in a position to do something or to make those big decisions about doing something. And there, I think, there are some special challenges and perhaps even some opportunities in this coming Congress and also in this upcoming presidential cycle that are worth our discussing. And I'm sure we'll have some chance and some differing opinion on the panel about this, so I just want to throw them out there as things to think about. The first is on the Democratic side, where despite the fact that there's been almost unified support for comprehensive immigration reform among faith groups, there's been a surprising reluctance among the Democratic Party right now to jump into immigration reform. And I think it's especially surprising given the fact that voting trends are showing more and more minority groups voting in larger numbers for Democratic candidates, and especially at the presidential level. And yet it does not seem to be something that the Democratic leaders in Congress certainly want to get into. And the White House has been inconsistent in terms of its appetite for getting into comprehensive immigration reform and supporting it in terms of getting some real action in the next few years. On the other side, we have, I think, a changing landscape in the Republican Party, where the number of Republican Catholics in this Congress doubled in the last election in 2010. And I think it's an open question of whether that means that they'll be in a position to influence the caucus and to really push their leadership towards more of a position in support of immigration reform, or whether that means that there are just more targets that the church is going to have to focus its lobbying efforts on and reach out to them because especially the newer members of Congress in the Republican Party do not always track with the church's position when it comes to immigration reform, and I think that will be a special challenge. In addition to the rise and the popularity of the Tea Party movement on the right, where I think it's fair to say that the Tea Party position on immigration also does not track with the church's support for reform, despite the fact that there's been pretty broad support among Republican Catholics. I think in a Pew poll last year, it found that 58% of Republican Catholics thought themselves sympathetic to the Tea Party. Despite that fact, there's a pretty big division between the kind of populist sense on the right when it comes to immigration and migrants and the position of the church. And the last I would say is just the way this whole issue gets framed in the public debate. And there I would put up myself and members of the media for questioning, as well as I think the church and the way that it chooses to frame this issue or prioritize this issue. If you were to talk to most of my colleagues and ask them what the last big issue was that the Bishops' Conference launched a postcard campaign on, and I hope I'm right in that this is the last one, they would say it was abortion issue, not immigration reform. In fact, they would be shocked to find out that there was a postcard campaign in support of immigration reform. The same thing when it comes to healthcare. If you ask people, why did the Bishops' Conference end up opposing the final health reform bill last year, they would say the only reason was abortion. They would be surprised to find that the statements that came out very consistently listed immigration and the fact that immigrants were left out of portions of health reform, in addition to concerns over whether abortion would be provided through federal funds. So that's just at the level of shaping the public debate, giving people a sense of where this lies in terms of a priority issue for the church. Because I think within the church and without are two very different senses of that. And again, some of that certainly lies with the responsibility of journalists who like the conflict and the struggles inherent in covering the abortion issue, but don't necessarily pay attention to things like immigration. But again, even there's an opportunity because if there are chances to lobby Republican Catholics who are not supporting immigration reform and supporting the church's position on this, that's an instance of conflict that even though it may frustrate people that that's what drives a lot of news coverage, it's an opportunity to write about something that's new that a lot of people don't know about, and the idea that the church would be lobbying Republican Catholics on an issue where they might not be following church teaching or supporting the church's position on it, I can guarantee you would be something that would get the attention of a lot of editors. It would certainly make it harder or easier for me to get my editors to sign off on letting me write about things like this more often. And I think it would also do the job of this public education, which is very, very difficult, but I think essential so that people can hold their representatives accountable on the issues that matter to them.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited here today. I'm not an expert on migration, and I cover the Vatican, which I guess makes me an expert on just about everything. But I should express my usual caveat here. I cover the Vatican. I do not speak for the Vatican. I don't come with a Vatican seal of approval, and anything I say is subject to the usual laws of fallibility, etc. I've covered the Vatican for about 30 years, and when I began doing my job, I was amazed to see how important immigration was, first to the Catholic Church, although I'm a lifelong Catholic, and second to the Vatican. I've been impressed over the years with how much energy and how much attention they give to this issue. And we heard this morning some of the milestone documents that have formed the Church's social teaching on immigration, and I won't repeat those. I will point out that I went back and I actually took a look at Pope Pius XII's 1952 Apostolic Constitution, Exul Familia Nazaretena, and I was shocked at how political the thing was. I mean, much of the bulk of that document is actually quotation from some of his messages to the U.S. government, saying, I think you have too restrictive immigration policies. So it's just kind of interesting that nowadays, if we hear talk about why is the Church weighing in on this at all, if you go back to that landmark document of Pope Pius XII, you will see he had no hesitation about wading into the politics of it. Of course, we have annual messages from the Pope. We don't only have those annual messages. Almost every time the Pope addresses a diplomat from a country or bishops from a country, he will also express the Church's judgment on how that country is doing in handling the immigration problem. And he's especially good, I think, about saying when countries, especially poor countries, have bent over backward to welcome immigration populations. He points it out. Of course, the Vatican diplomacy is working with immigration every single day, not only in its diplomatic stations in every country, but at its missions at the United Nations, and especially in Geneva, where they have a mission to UN agencies. And that mission probably devotes at least half of its work to migration issues. And from that mission comes some of the most detailed policy statements about migration, surprisingly detailed. We have Caritas, which handles direct assistance, coordinating aid. So I think the Vatican's dealing with this on many fronts. There's a high level of expertise, which kind of surprises me too. They care about this issue. They're not just moral generalizations, they're policy statements, and they get into the nitty-gritty of it. At the same time, I would say that there are some differences the way the Vatican deals with some of the political fallout. Now, obviously, immigration is not just a U.S. issue. It's an Italian issue. It's a European issue. And if you're somebody at the Secretary of State level, you may approach it differently than, say, somebody at Caritas Internationalis or even at the diplomatic mission in Geneva. So, that might be an interesting thing to discuss, how the Vatican has dealt basically with the immigration policy of Silvio Berlusconi, for example, which is exceedingly restrictive. I think for many people, the key question about immigration these days is, are they legal or not? And anytime a pope says something about this, it's likely to find an echo chamber somewhere nowadays. Pope Benedict addressed the question in kind of neutral terms, as popes will do, in his latest message for World Migration Day. He said that basically immigrants need to respect the laws of the state, and that the states do have the right to regulate the flow of immigration. Of course, he also spoke about the right to immigrate as a basic fundamental human right. But it's interesting that this time around I noticed some media and blogs picking up on the first part of that statement, which is the state's right to regulate, almost as if, raising the question, should the church be helping these illegal immigrants at all? And obviously, I see that as a misreading of what the Pope said. But I think the people, even average Catholics, seem to be very sensitive to this question. Are they legal or illegal? Or, to use preferred terminology, documented or undocumented? On World Migration Day itself this year, Pope Benedict said Jesus was a refugee. Again, you know, this is kind of standard for people who know the history of the migration issue in the Catholic Church, referring, of course, to the flight into Egypt of the Holy Family. Well, I duly wrote my story. It's like a 200-word story, and I heard back from so many people and on so many blogs, negatively, Jesus was not a refugee. He was a legal citizen of his country. Jesus was not an immigrant. He was just going from one part of the Roman Empire to another, like you go from state to state. And my favorite one was, Jesus was not an immigrant unless you count when he immigrated to heaven. And I hope he had his papers in order when he went. But these may seem like silly distinctions, but I think they reflect a core concern among a lot of people. You know, was Jesus' family acting against the law in some way? And if so, it seems to some people to be this dangerous precedent that we should not acknowledge. I think I'll end there and pass the mic over to my colleague.
Can you hear me okay with this mic? Yes? Maybe I dreamed. Sure. This better? Yes. Okay. Well, I'm definitely the right-hand side of the table here. When I came in, Peggy, my old friend Peggy, said to me, "You're very brave to come here." And I don't know if that's true or not, but there ought to be more people, I think, invited to these events, and perhaps they are. Kevin said to me that he had difficulty inviting people of a more conservative perspective to show up. And I think that's a problem, because I think that the conversation that's going on, even within the church, is impoverished by the fact that there are stereotypes in both directions about what people believe and what their ultimate goals are. I can't go into much more about that right now because I want to get to some other points, but I'm going to start with, Nietzsche says in one of his books that every idea has an autobiography. And I want to just talk in a personal sense to begin with about a family reaction, my own family reaction, to the illegal immigration question. Now, I happen to have breakfast every morning with an immigrant. And since I'm married to her, I have to listen to what she says to me. My wife's family were Catholic Slavs who were picked up by the Nazis and taken to work camps during World War II. They escaped to France as the Third Reich was collapsing, and she was born in France and immigrated to the United States with her family several years later at great cost and trouble, and with all the usual legal requirements in those days. She also works in teaching in a Catholic school that is predominantly Hispanic. Most of the Hispanic families illegal, as I would call them. I think calling people who are here illegally undocumented is evading the truth and not helpful for convincing conservatives who need to have their concerns acknowledged and recognized if a conversation is going to start. But my wife is the conservative in our household, and I'm liberal. Because I say back to her, she is very much opposed to people breaking the law and entering illegally. She regards, for her, the social justice question is how can you possibly think it's just to treat people who have broken the law to come into this country the way that my family is treated? Now, you may regard this as a kind of an airy-fairy, abstract question for some people, but it is not all that abstract for a lot of people in the country. And furthermore, the question of breaking the law and entering illegally is a bit different from breaking other laws. Because as we know, you can commit murder or rape or all sorts of crimes in the United States and still pay your debt to society and be integrated back into the community. The difference in this particular breaking of the law is that it's a breaking of the law by people who are not legally part of the community. And we perhaps can talk about that a bit more in the discussion later. My response to her and what I put in front of you is that is all true. However, we are not, despite wild talk by some conservatives, we are not going to deport 10 or 20 million people from the United States. So that does not happen absent a figure like Stalin or Mao. America is a nation of immigrants, and we will never go down that path. So there are two possibilities, political possibilities, facing us about I'm talking largely about the Hispanic immigration. There are two large political possibilities. We will continue the way we have, which I don't consider to be a particularly conservative position, to allow a condition of illegality to persist with all the human and spiritual and moral questions that raises. Or we will find a way to talk with one another about what kind of compromises can be made in some longer fashion to regularize, I would say, perhaps even somewhat harshly regularize, but regularize the situation of tens of millions of people. I don't think it helps, and this may be a shock to some of you, I don't think it helps to call bills introduced to Congress dream acts when they deal with questions that people are very sensitive about regarding legality and illegality. Okay? Now, about legality and illegality. A country whose culture is strong and confident, which is to say a country not like the United States at the present moment, is far better situated to accept even large numbers of immigrants. And I think that some of the nervousness that people detect in the public as a whole, and one of the reasons why even Democrats are rather reluctant to touch this question, is precisely because there's a great deal of nervousness about the fragility right now of American culture, economics, et cetera. I don't think economics, by the way, is the central question about immigration. I don't think it will be decided because someone discovers that immigrants are a net plus or a net minus in the society. I think that actually is off the table. Similarly, I don't think that it's a question of racism. Is there anti-Hispanic prejudice in the United States? Of course. Is that what really drives the debate about immigration in the United States? I think not. It goes much deeper, and it resonates with some core understanding of what this country is. That very funny man, G.K. Chesterton, once said about the United States that it is a nation with the soul of a church. And what he meant by that is, since we don't have a common ethnicity in the United States, we don't have a long history of living together, although we're the oldest modern democracy, by the way, continuous modern democracy. What that means is there are very fragile bonds that hold us together, and law is one of the most important of those bonds. And that's, again, why this is, I think, there's a great deal of nervousness about this. Now, I happen to take Kevin's invitation as an opportunity to write an op-ed column, which I'm not going to read to you right now, but I want to just, in closing, Peggy, don't worry, I just want to mention that I approach this question not through economics, not through demographics, not even through the legal question, but through three categories that I think are biblical. That Catholics or God's people are prophets, they're priests, and they're kings. And let me just quickly sum up why I use those three categories. I think one of the ruts that the church is in is trying to be prophetic about this issue. There are moral issues out there. There's no question about this. It's important to tell people that they must welcome the stranger among them. The statistics are all, I think, uncertain about this, but most Americans intuitively know that we already do welcome a lot of strangers among us. The last figures I looked at said 1 million legal and illegal immigrants per year. 1.25 million people receive permanent residency status per year. And according to one Pew survey, there's been a very sharp increase in the number of people who are naturalized. So I think all these numbers suggest to us already that although we can do more, we can do better, and we certainly need to do something about this very uncomfortable illegal situation that we find ourselves in. A lot of the opposition to the sort of lecturing of Americans about welcoming the stranger feels like lecturing, feels like easy sermonizing and easy easy attempts to be a prophet about something that America, if we are honest about this, has done better than most countries in the history of the world. And that's simply a factual way of looking at it. Second point, about this priestly dimension. The prophet holds the culture up to the highest standards. The prophet calls the culture out to be everything it can be. And when I think of a religious prophet in America, and maybe a lot of us think of this too, it's Martin Luther King Jr. writing from Birmingham jail, in which he appeals to what's best in the American tradition itself against a type of discrimination against a group of Americans that cannot stand scrutiny under American principles. But over against the prophet dimension, there's a priestly dimension. And King was a brilliant orator in that way as well. Because if the prophet holds the culture up to criticism, the priestly dimension has to call the culture to itself. It has to put a sort of sacred canopy over the culture. And in our culture, as nervous as it is about itself right now, I think Catholics have a special vocation to try to talk about what's good in America and to call America not only to even better things, but to affirm what's already here, because that's what actually helps people feel confident about accepting challenges like large numbers of immigrants. Finally, this kingly dimension. Now, we probably are going to want to talk a lot about this, but in a society like ours, a nation with the soul of a church, the rule of law and the common good are extremely important, and Catholics understand those concepts in very sophisticated, deep ways because we've been talking about them for centuries. There's no other tradition in the United States, or perhaps even around the world, that can do what we are able to do about that point. To me, this means that we have to be very cautious as a church when we talk about law, because the Catholic tradition brings such a sophisticated analysis to bear. It ought to always have that sophistication present. And unlike my colleague, I have to say I was quite appalled when Cardinal Mahoney, I think out of good motives, called for civil disobedience after the Arizona immigration law last year or the year before. Because I think that most people perceive this as the church encouraging people again to break the law. Now, that may be an unfair reading, but it's what I think a lot of people believe. And also, a lot of people notice that the church, which believes that abortion is the taking of human life, does not call for widespread civil disobedience. And American Catholics and non-Catholics see this sort of action and non-action, and they draw conclusions from it, sometimes conclusions perhaps that are not fortunate. So, prophetic, priestly, kingly, these are very demanding categories, but Christ never said it was going to be easy for us in society, and if Catholics don't do it, I don't know who else in our world will. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Well, Bob put a big question on the table, and I don't know why we shouldn't talk about it immediately with the panel members. And that is, we all know, we have neighbors, we have friends, we have relatives who do not share perhaps our position on this question, like Bob's wife doesn't share his. And it seems to me one of the ways to think about this question is, as Bob suggests, what are the arguments, the reasons, the impulses, the emotions that people who are, they may not be opposed to all policy changes or to all practices, but seem to have a kind of animus on this subject. And I think that's one way to talk about how do you think about policy, how do you think about changing people's minds, et cetera. So Frank, since I bet you've heard a lot of these arguments, why don't we start with you?
And I too am happy that Bob is here and is being so provocative and honest with all of us, because I think there's a lot to chew on here. First of all, I think your analysis is basically right, that what drives so much of the frustration is legitimate and has to do with what people see as the unfairness of violating the law to get in. I do think that what drives the activists that oppose reform, many of them tend to, I think, just going to be blunt, I think they harbor a racial an ethnic animosity that and then they prey on the legitimate frustrations of many people in the middle. So you acknowledge there's people who discriminate. I think we're up against an anti-immigrant movement that I've studied for 30 years, and when you look under the hood, it's not pretty. But the basic point of a lot of people who are frustrated with this issue, the polling that I find very compelling on this is when you ask, who do you blame for illegal immigration? In polls, it's not the immigrant who's here illegally. That comes in pretty low. The employers who hire them, a bit higher. It's really a frustration with the federal government's inability to solve this problem. So just to be less kind of combative and more to find common ground and to speak about the role of the Catholic Church, the fact of the matter is that the Catholic Church in 2006 and in 2007 stretched mightily to come up with just the kind of compromises that I think you're talking about, Bob, to try to meet people, not in the middle, but to put it in a political spectrum, right of center so that more conservatives would be comfortable with a combination of policies that was a heavy dose of enforcement combined with a path to legal status and a very arduous, if not perhaps impossible, path to citizenship for many. And a guest worker program that would be hard to argue was about protecting the rights of the workers and easy to argue was about giving employers access to cheap labor. So a very flawed deal that was designed to get conservative and Republican votes that failed because it did not get those votes. George W. Bush spent whatever political capital he had in a heroic fashion to try to get this deal. John McCain almost sacrificed his political career for it. Ted Kennedy was about the only Democrat standing up speaking on the floor during the debate. It was so unpopular among Democrats. But at the end of the day, it was about a solution that would restore the rule of law to our immigration system by dealing realistically with the people here and coming up with a system going forward where illegality was punished hard and on the margins rather than the norm that it's been. So just wanted to, for those of us who believe deeply in justice for immigrants, we also believe deeply in the rule of law. We also believe deeply in compromise. And quite frankly, we haven't found the willing partners to get to the number. Yes, some Democrats are cowardly, but Republicans have become downright obstructionists.
Amy, I don't know, from your reporting, do you have any insight into the oppositional question?
In terms of who is
Well, I mean,
opposing or
I
why?
think there are several layers here. I mean, one is the government, one's the Congress, one's church
Well,
organizations,
there's certainly,
et cetera.
yeah, the congressional debate and the question of whether it will be taken up at that level. And then, you know, I spoke about the fact that Democrats are not eager to make this a key issue for
Well, maybe
2012.
that's one question.
And-
What do you detect among those who one might think were more sympathetic?
Well, part of it is that although you know, this is such an unusual election cycle in that we are in March of 2011 and don't know who's running for president on the Republican side, really. But the assumption by many Democrats is that the Republican candidates for the primaries will be all too eager to talk about immigration reform, but that will put them in a position of getting into some of the issues that Frank mentioned about, you know, whether we're actually talking about immigration or whether that is kind of a way of getting at other issues in terms of the growing number of minorities in the U.S. population. You know, things that have come up as kind of dog whistles with Barack Obama that maybe Democrats want to stay away from. You know, I think just related what I was thinking about when he was talking is the fact that the question of illegal immigration is often posed as a growing problem. And I think it's worth acknowledging the fact that wherever you stand on it, you may think it's a problem. It's not necessarily a growing problem. In a Pew report last year, they actually found that illegal immigration to the U.S., so that's not the numbers within the U.S., but coming to the U.S. every year has dropped by about 2/3 in the last 10 years. So again, still a legitimate question to talk about, a legitimate problem and fear for a lot of people to have. But in terms of, is this where the momentum is? Is it an increasing issue? The numbers just aren't there for it. Now, numbers don't affect what people feel in terms of what their perception is. But if you get beyond that to what really is increasing, well, what's increasing is the percentage of Latinos in the American population and the birth rates. These are questions which I think are much trickier for people to debate. But they may be what's kind of underlying all of the talk about immigration. And it's worth getting at those, because if we're going to have a discussion about whether people are uncomfortable with the number of Latinos in the American population, we should have that, not hidden behind immigration reform.
John, I don't know whether you have any particular observations?
Oh, I always have something to say.
All right.
In looking at this whole question of illegal or undocumented migrants, I went back and read a speech that was given a year or so ago by the UN representative to Geneva. I think it was the UNHCR. No, it was to the International Organization for Migration, and it laid out sort of the Vatican's position on illegal immigration, and he didn't call it illegal immigration. He said migrants in irregular administrative status number about 40 million worldwide today. So it's a global issue. It's not just a U.S. issue. He said there are an estimated 8 million irregular migrants in Europe. In Asia, 30 to 40% of all migration flows are estimated to take place through irregular channels. Now, this speech went on to point out some of the issues that make this a tricky question. It's not just a question, are they legal or are they illegal, obviously, or we wouldn't be having this discussion probably. They don't want to be illegal. They're illegal because the country they want to emigrate to has not documented them. And yet, as the Vatican keeps pointing out again and again, the illegal or irregular workers who go to a country generally match the need for manpower in that country. There's an economic need for these people. And I'm not sure if that's always acknowledged in this country. I know in Italy, they try to pretend it doesn't exist, but I mean it does. And you can see by looking around at who's doing the menial jobs. He pointed out in this speech that the irregular migrants are the most vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, not to mention human trafficking. He called for a new management strategy that goes beyond individual national interests, recognizing that popular stereotypes are not true. I think one of the things the Vatican keeps calling for is education against the stereotypes that illegal immigrants are job stealers. How this actually gets done is a whole other question, which maybe we should discuss. But the Vatican has issued pretty comprehensive guidelines on the kind of catechesis that's needed at the very local level in order to get away from these stereotypes as well.
Okay. And Bob, since you brought up the subject,
Which subject was that?
you decide.
I want to say another moral category for me that was just brought up is this. The United States has a certain moral responsibility now for the people who are here illegally, because the American people and the federal government have allowed this situation to persist for so long. I mean, there's no question in my mind that the United States as a nation has to take some responsibility for what it's allowed to happen. Now, whether economic pressures are really what drive things, these things are very hard to measure. It seems to me that when you talk with an economist, they'll always, a scientific sort of economist, what they'll say to you is, if you do X, Y will happen, other things being equal, which of course they never are. If there were not so many illegal immigrants to the United States, would those jobs simply go unfulfilled? It's hard to say. Could this have been handled in a different way by increased legal immigration or some other fashion? I don't know. I mean, these are large and imponderable questions. But what I do want to say is this: this conversation, this impasse between what seems to be liberal and conservative positions, which in fact, liberal and conservative positions don't entirely line up with Democrats and Republicans, as Peggy and I learned some years ago when we did a survey in this Pew Project that we did together. There's actually a large mix, even among Catholics, and things become very confused very quickly. But I would come back again and say, whether the number is going down, whether there's some economic reason for this, people are very frustrated. And if you want the conversation to succeed, you cannot begin by lecturing people and telling them that they're being immoral. I think what you have to appeal to is the fact that a culture is itself a spiritual and moral being. No culture goes to heaven or to hell, but there is a kind of a human community that has a spiritual dimension to it. And when people feel that that dimension is being threatened, they get very nervous. And there's a kind of a double standard that gets practiced when we talk about respecting other people's cultures, their history, their nations, which I think Americans in general tend to do, in general. And then we turn around to the United States and we kind of give the impression that changes in American culture, especially changes that some people may feel are out of control, don't matter. That somehow our culture is the one culture that is just a receiving culture rather than a culture that is a substantive culture in and of itself. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. John, your remarks did bring something to mind about Europe and in particular the Benedict on this question, and the whole question really of Eurocentrism in the debate, partly about the admission of Turkey to the EU, but also about the numbers of Muslim immigrants to Germany and France and Italy and Spain, etc. And it sometimes does strike me that Americans are all too willing to talk about these problems and these issues even if sometimes in an agonistic way, but that Europeans are much more reluctant to speak about these forthrightly. What do you think?
I think that's probably true. First let me start by noting that in his World Migration Day message this year, I noticed a phrase that seemed to me to be new, and that was when the Pope said that immigrants not only need to respect the laws of the state, but also the national identity. That seemed to me to be a kind of phrase from the European culture wars that somehow snuck into the document. Maybe his aides, who are in the Secretary of State, who are primarily European, shoehorned it in there. But it was without explanation, but it seemed to reflect this kind of concern in some European quarters that, yeah, there's been massive immigration of non-Christians in recent years. And is that somehow threatening the cultural and national identities of these countries? I don't think the Vatican is worried about the Islamization of Europe. I think the Vatican is worried that in the name of tolerance or in the name of protecting Europe's new religious minorities, there will be efforts to limit and restrict the expression of religion across the board. And I guess you had the classic example recently of the case of the display of crucifixes in Italian public schools.
Okay. You can. Could we just continue for a few more minutes? Okay. Frank, one of the arguments about the failed law in, 2007, was the last time we did this, we only carried out the federal government only carried out half the law that had been passed. Now, number one, is that true? And number two, what about the legislation that was proposed in '7 and could be proposed again would effectively say we're going to do the whole thing?
You know, the original, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 was flawed in its premise. It legalized half the population, not most of it. It had employer sanctions that was based on paper, that were easy to undermine with forged documents and employers who looked the other way. And you had no provision for future migration from the country that was sending most of the workers here illegally, Mexico. So it was doomed to fail in that it wasn't comprehensive enough.
Was it planned to fail?
No. It was a very rough first draft of an issue that's poorly understood. I think it was, you know, the basic idea at the heart of it, which is still at the heart of reform, is that you have to combine effective enforcement with legal channels in order to transform a dysfunctional, chaotic system into an orderly one. Mm-hmm. But the policy levers at the time were inadequate, and the political space for a more comprehensive bill was not there. By the way, we still face that now, in that there's obviously not the political space to be able to enact such a broad reform. I think the policy ideas on the table are quite 21st century. I mean, you look at the binational letter from Mexico and U.S. bishops on what's the diagnosis and what's the solution. That, to me, is one of the best policy documents I've seen in describing here's the reality and here's how we can fix it in a way that deals with the interests of a nation to have control and the church's interest that human life be respected. So, you know, I think we've got the right policy ideas. What we don't have is enough votes.
And are you also saying you really don't have a mode for executing a comprehensive law?
Well, I think executing a comprehensive law would be very challenging for federal bureaucracy. But I mean, having looked at this for 30 years, the idea that anything we do is going to be easy is wrong. That piecemeal approaches could have lots of unintended consequences, and the status quo is the worst of all possible situations.
Okay.
So I'm willing to risk it. But apparently, politicians who fear that if they did something like this, they would suffer a backlash, particularly on the Republican side. Some Democrats aren't there yet. But you know, I just want to say one thing about the church's moral stand on this, and whether it's preachy or on point. I do agree that we all as advocates need to do a better job of connecting with people's frustration about this issue. And I know that's sometimes controversial among advocates. It shouldn't be. There's a lot of legitimate frustration. Yes, there are people who are demonizing and dehumanizing immigrants on a daily basis in hopes of driving them out of the country. I'm not talking about those folks. I'm talking about the people who are genuinely concerned. But I think if we only talk about that and we don't get to the moral stand that's at the heart of it, I think we are missing a tremendous opportunity, both as church and as Americans, to stand for what we stand for. The reason, Bob, that advocates like in this room are so passionate about this subject is because we work with these folks. We know these folks. And so when you hear people saying the laws are perfect and these people are criminals, when our experience is that the law is terrible and these people are noble because they're risking their lives to feed their families, and they have violated laws that, quite frankly, to me, have the moral stature of jaywalking laws in order to build a better life. And then, you know, I don't see them as criminals. I see them as future citizens who we've invited in to do our dirty work, and we do have a moral complicity and a moral obligation. Now, I know that's preachy to some, but that's also true. So I'm all about being practical about the rule of law and reestablishing it, but I don't think we can drop out the humanity that's at the core of this, which is human beings who have no line to get into coming to this country, most of whom have been here for more than a decade, most of whom are in families, and they're trying to create a better life for their families and making a contribution to their country, the country that they've adopted. So to me, I think they're Americans and all but paperwork.
There have been calls for questions, and since Bishop Ramirez made the first call, I'm going to ask him to ask the first question. To your colleague from Arizona? No. All right, now, I'm from New York, and so we have a way about doing this sort of thing at Fordham, and it is questions, please. Short statements, no sermons, no speeches, et cetera, okay?
I have.
You got it?
Yeah, we got it. We got
Okay.
it. On this question, to this question.
Could you identify
yeah,
yourself?
Alan Sanchez from New Mexico.
Hello.
I was very intrigued with the comments you were giving, and when we go to lobby or work legislators, our society is so overwhelmed with short messages, with sound bites. And my question would be to you each is, what sound bite would you give us on this? Because it's so complicated, and in there I did want to say something, but for us on the law or the love, those two things are huge challenges for us to make a message. We're not a melting pot. We're a salad, and that's like the big problem we have. We're not a melting pot, and that this issue of law, if we're law-abiding, and that binds us together, because we're a salad, not a melting pot, our prisons wouldn't be overflowing. So how do we go with a soundbite, and it's particularly like for my Republican friends that I have to lobby on this, and if the four of you each could give me a soundbite, because that's hard to do.
Right, you're all wordsmiths. Okay, get to work. Bob? Make it short.
I'm going to get to that in a second, but I just want to say something to Fred first. Okay. Who I'm starting to love because he's very passionate and what he says is hard. I think you can't say the soundbite if you think that it's like jaywalking. And if you wonder why people have the impression that the bishops believe in open borders, which is what a political scientist from Boston College told me, who's not a lapsed Catholic but kind of a fallen away Catholic, it maybe is because that they hear that passion about loving the people, which I think we all ought to do, and they hear the almost dismissiveness toward the law. So if I were advising you, I don't have, if I had a bumper sticker, I could probably make $1 million right this afternoon off it. But I think I would emphasize the question of the law, that we want these people to be brought under the law. You know, we want a law that is going, we're not going to deport them. We know we're not going to deport them. And so we have to find some way to take this large group of people and find a law that is going to apply to them so that they become, in some sense, a part of our legal system. You know, the legal system in the United States, as I said earlier, is one of the few commonalities that we have. And when people treat that lightly, it scares people because they don't know what else is going to hold us together. And it's not an opposition of love and law, because in public questions, the rule of law is the expression of love. And for the Catholic Church in particular, I think the Catholic Church is uniquely positioned to talk to immigrant groups who have suffered under a lack of rule of law, very often in their home countries, and explain to them, as happened in previous waves of immigration, why it is and when it is that institutions are to be trusted and to be built up and loved. You know? So I don't know. I think somehow...
You can work on that for a few minutes for a bumper
that's a long
sticker.
bumper sticker.
Okay. Amy.
Well, in terms of the bumper sticker, I was always awful at headline writing. But if you want one with puns, I could probably come up with that. That was always what we resorted to. But I did want to answer your question, Peggy, which I did not previously, about kind of what's standing in the way. And Frank asked, where are the votes? We have everything but the votes. And point out that this is an issue which is not alone in being one in which there is not a lot of political courage to be shown on any side. It's an extremely easy issue to demagogue, and I think that's one reason when we eventually have those Republican primary debates, that you will see a spectrum from pretty solidly opposed to extremely solidly opposed to immigration reform. Mike Huckabee, interestingly, has been one of the few people to be willing to speak out on the Republican side. He was opposing the efforts last year of a few people to call for the rescinding of the 14th Amendment, and did so in biblical terms. As a good Baptist minister, he has the knowledge of the parables to bring along with those. But I think even he, should he end up becoming a candidate, will temper that a bit, simply because it's so easy to move from a discussion of immigration reform to national security, to you're endangering Americans, to you're taking away American jobs. And there's not a lot of attempts to add nuance to that discussion.
Okay, your
the
bumper
other-
sticker.
I'm going to move on to Democrats and just say that Bush really did try to apply a lot of political capital the last time this came around a few years ago. And the problem was, I think, he didn't have as much political capital as he thought he would have when it came around to that. And right now, the Obama White House is trying to figure out how much capital they do have to be able to push this. And unfortunately, there's also a just really crass political math that is going on among Democratic consultants trying to figure out, okay, well, we're getting a larger and larger percentage of the Latino vote, but we lost a lot of white men last time around. So does one equal out another? They don't think it does. And I think the opportunity here is those white men that Democrats are losing, a lot of them are Catholics. And it's not necessarily a given that they're going to be staunchly opposed to immigration reform, but I don't think that's anywhere in the room when these get discussed. The idea that there could be a positive case to make to those voters that Democrats have been losing.
Okay. Your bumper sticker? You're not going to go that route?
I got lots of bumper stickers,
Okay.
but
All right. Let's have
here
them.
for Bishop
Oh.
Lewinski.
Okay.
I think what was very useful is what Robert Royal said about the fact that the culture is very fragile. And the debate is on immigration reform can be demonized because of the fragility of that culture. This is a surrogate or a scapegoat for a deeper question in American culture today, perhaps. And I think I would say, and I've said this before, that it's American culture today is a secularized Calvinism. And at secularized Calvinism, with the influence of nominalism, and we have legal positivism today, where what is legal is right, and what is not legal is wrong. So in American culture today, we can say that abortion has to be okay because it's legal. And these illegal aliens can't be good moral people because they are illegal. That secularized Calvinism, I think, is one of the things that is, causing this debate to be so difficult to move to a resolution. And again, it reminds me of Richard Newhouse's books about the Catholic moment. We have a Catholic ethos that is not Calvinistic, natural law, et cetera, et cetera. As Catholics, we should be pretty understanding about illegal things. We understood that something could be illegal and not wrong. That's why in the Prohibition, my father and grandfather had no problem going to a speakeasy to buy beer or helping to move beer across, to the KAC Hall and other places like that. It was legal, but Catholics knew it wasn't wrong because we understood. We had an approach to law and to that was a little bit broader than our Protestant Calvinist. Now, when you see how Catholics are becoming anti-immigrant, it seems to be an indication of how much they have been absorbed into the American culture. It represents the Americanization of Catholics and a bit their decatholicization. And the only other thing I would say, following up on Robert Royale's presentation, which I thought was very good for that insight he provided us, is that even though the immigrants seem to want to support Democrats and vote for them, I think there's an argument we can make from the conservative side that these new immigrants are potential allies on the side of the conservatives in the cultural wars of our country today. And I think that's maybe one key that we could, if you're looking for the bumper sticker thing, because these immigrants, they're not going to support gay marriage. They're not going to support, a culture of conspicuous consumption, because they're coming here and they're sacrificing themselves to send money back to their families. They believe in the traditional ethic of the American dream. You work hard and you can become something for yourself. They're generally pro-life, which is why we have people wanting to take away citizenship from their children, because they have kids and they accept kids. So I think that's perhaps an approach that we could do to work on our more conservative end of the line, is to say these people are potentially your best allies, and also to propose again Catholic teaching, the way of the Catholic approach to law and natural law, so that we get away from this secularized Calvinism. After all, Americans honored the Boston Tea Party people, and they broke the law. We honor today Rosa Parks, and she broke the law. So I think there's room for us in our culture to make room to accept the irregulars, to regularize them, or the illegals, however you want to call them, and to do so in a way that we can perhaps address the fears of people because of their fragility and their discomfort, their non-confidence in the present state of American culture. People don't fear change; they feel loss. They fear loss, and we have to, present the regularization of the undocumented in this country as not a loss to America or to our society, but it might bring change, but it also brings gain.
Okay. I guess we're going in with the questions. Bishop? Yes, right. Well, actually, I believe you're from Brooklyn.
You see,
Am I wrong about
the
that?
The prejudice of the Bronx is there, isn't it? I have a bumper sticker. It's all about work, because that's the key to the social question, and those are the words of the soon-to-be-beatified John Paul II. The key to the social question is work. What he says social question, that means the common good. Why are the undocumented, the illegals, the irregulars here? To work. They're all working. There's nobody parked in a park in the Bronx or in Brooklyn or out here in a tent because they all have houses because they work to pay rent. We don't have the situation where in Europe they are parked on the grates in Paris because there's no place to go. That's not our situation. They're not among the homeless for the most part. So basically we've got to look at the issue of work, and that's the key to what this is about. We've looked at securing the border. That's not what we need to secure. It's the workplace. That's what people come to do. If you want to do something, secure the workplace. That's where the enforcement should be. That's why nobody has a stomach to do it, because the Republicans are the ones that are employing them, and the Democrats recognize that that's their votes. So nobody wants to touch that problem. That is the problem. And the major problem is that we live in a globalized world that has a globalized workforce. And the people from Mexico will keep coming because we have NAFTA. We're moving goods and services across the border, and people will come with it. It's all about work. That's your bumper sticker.
You got that, Mr. Sanchez? I just have a little statistic here that I found fascinating. It's from a recent Pew poll in which they asked people what was they, how did they hear about immigration, or what formed their views. And what was fascinating is that 32% of the Catholics who go to church twice a month or more said that they heard the clergy speaking about immigration. That was the highest of any religious group in the country. When they were also asked, what is the biggest influence on your views on immigration, they had among the lowest, 7%. Responded that religion was a big influence on their views. Didn't say what their views were. But that suggests to me there's even preaching on this subject or talking about it does not necessarily produce, I suspect, agreement with what is being taught and preached. And so I guess I would say that once again points to this underlying cultural issue, and it is not for many people a theological issue, a religious issue, or a biblical issue. And nobody has to comment on that, but
I would just have a quick comment that I think that underscores the extent to which it's seen as an optional issue by a lot of Catholics. And that, to me, gets at where it falls within the priorities of the church. Just in watching the changing nature of the two-party caucuses in Congress over the last decade or so, it's been striking to me that there isn't a Republican version of Bob Casey. That is to say, somebody who, likes to describe himself as a whole-life Catholic, somebody who can buck his party on abortion, but who can be fairly liberal when it comes to a lot of issues, precisely because of his Catholic faith. It's very, very hard to find the flip of that in the Republican Party. And in fact, if you look at, yes, they're going back out to Iowa later this week for another evangelical summit, some of the Republican possible contenders. You've got Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, both of whom have been very upfront about their Catholicism, talk about it a lot, but who do not see immigration as one of those issues where it needs to influence where they fall on that. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Maybe it should continue to be an optional issue, but if it does, it will continue, I think, to keep the political stalemate that you've got now, because it won't be seen as something that should drive people's votes, and people won't worry that their bishop's going to call them and call them to account on a vote that they take.
thank you. Okay,
Yes, with respect to the rule of law, as Catholics, what should we do with the divine lawgiver who has given us divine revelation in his rule of law and the magisterium that has followed in the footsteps of divine revelation versus your positive rule of law?
I think he was pointing to you, Bob.
I mean, I think, as you know, there's a whole developed Catholic tradition about divine law, eternal law, natural law, black letter law, and laws that contradict the divine law are unjust laws. Simple.
Thank you. Yes.
So this is one last simple, maybe a question, maybe a comment, but because I work at Sacred Heart Church in New Brunswick, we have a large Hispanic Latino population, and they're amazing, wonderful people. But what I have seen happen is our American people are leaving. And so
Leaving the
leaving-
parish?
Yes.
Okay.
So, but here's a story, because I kept my ear to the ground and I listened. A family who were hardworking Americans, adopted 2 children from China, and they had to dot all the I's and cross all the T's and fill out forms till they were blue in the face. And they got the babies and they brought them to the U.S. And now when they went to the emergency room at the hospital and they had their insurance to pay for medical care, they sat next to immigrants who didn't have insurance, didn't have legal papers, and so but they were treated the same. So that's what's
They were treated the same in what way?
Oh, they got the care in the emergency room, got the health care. And so while we want that for them, but we don't want the immigrants to be frightened so that they can't work, pay taxes, have a social security number, and then be able to buy insurance. So if that could happen, everybody would be totally happy. Yes?
Really? Totally? Wow. That's a big promise.
Well, maybe not totally, but it would help because we're losing, even tax dollars. If people are being paid those little baby wages and they're not paying taxes, so the country's being hurt as well.
Thank you. I see Tom Roberts lurking.
I just, for the record, in the gulf between Frank's passion and Robert's concern for law, I hear a lot of similarities. And what I'd like to know, just for the record, is if you could each outline for me, us, your ideal law on this thing. How do we solve it? Five major points, briefly.
I have no doubt that Bob and I could cut a deal on this. And no doubt, because of the way he talks about it. He's not an extremist or absolutist on it. He acknowledges the rule of law and the frustration that's driving it, and we better figure out how to fix the system so that it ends illegal immigration and doesn't recreate it. So the policies that my organization subscribes to, very close to where the church is at, we're all for border security. And, this is one sentence, by the way, and we're all for a crackdown on illegal hiring through the use of mandatory employment verification. And we're interested in a 21st century legal immigration system so that workers and families can come to the United States in a legal, orderly process, but that's also flexible and generous enough to meet law and demand, not the rigid system we've had for the past 20 years that hasn't been able to do so. And we have to have a regularization process for non-criminal undocumented immigrants in the United States in which they, yes, learn English, pay taxes, and prove that they're going to be good Americans to be able to get on a path to citizenship. Deal?
Hallelujah, brother. I just want to add, though, Tom, I think the problem is not, as we've been talking about in this whole panel, it's not so much those particulars, because broadly speaking, I don't know what else could possibly solve this problem. And I say again, the only alternative to some solution like that is the status quo, which is terrible. I mean, everybody admits it's terrible, liberals and conservatives. The problem is, how can a conversation take place that would enable people to have enough mutual respect for one another, understanding of what perhaps even what horse trading has to be done, so that you come out somewhere near what Frank just said. And I think that this is where that cultural question becomes all important, and particularly within the church. I mean, if people are not getting that this is an important problem, I'm not surprised that they're not getting it from listening to sermons, because we know what happens in
They're not listening,
that.
you
So,
mean.
yeah, they're not listening. But a larger American conversation, cultural conversation about what we want, I think, is the only plausible path by which we're going to get to something like the place where the two sides can agree. And there are more than two sides, but sides can agree on a rough system like the one Frank outlined.
Yes, Kevin.
Hi. So this is sort of a different variation of what you just heard, but so looking into the future, what's the hope in some ways? I mean, we're in a situation where we've got a difficult economy, we've got the cultural fears that Bob talked about, we still have national security concerns. and we have a citizenry that is just ambivalent at best about this issue. Give me as many things as you want, but at least 2 or 3 things that the church needs to do to get us to some light on this issue. What can the church do that's not doing or do differently to sort of change the tide on this issue, if anything? I mean, it seems like the barriers are so imposing at the moment that that anything wouldn't work, but I don't believe that. I think that the American people want a solution to this and are looking for leadership. What can the church do to speak to those Republican Catholics in the House, to create a Bob Casey on the right to join with a Democrat, to speak in a way that responds to those Catholics who are concerned about the rule of law and how that impacts, and that talks about the generosity of the American people. I mean, probably answering my own question, but 2 or 3 things that you would advise the bishops or the church leadership as to what they can do that they're already doing and do it better, or how they should change their message or tactics.
Amy, okay.
Yeah, and this should not be construed as unpaid political advice from a journalist. But obviously, representatives listen most to what the Catholics in their own district are thinking, so the public education piece of it continues to be important. And perhaps it's a matter of not having the one immigration sermon per year, but something to make clear that this is an ongoing interest of the church and a priority that it intends for parishioners to know about, while also, I think, acknowledging the concerns that can lead to opposition, because I think those have to be together in balance. But representatives, and I can tell you this having worked for a Democratic Catholic senator, are also extremely interested in what the Catholic leaders in their districts or states have to say. And so getting in there with bishops to talk to them is essential, and making it clear what a priority this is. Just in the last week, the Church of Latter-day Saints actually came out in support of comprehensive immigration reform. Now, I'm betting they're not going to put a lot of pressure on Orrin Hatch, since he seems to have beaten back so far a challenge from the right, from a Tea Party candidate in his re-election campaign. So I don't expect him to stand up and declare that he is all in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. But there are Catholics who are not in races that are as challenging as his could be, who I think should be pushed a little bit on this. There's something to be said for being Catholics who represent the church publicly. And this is an argument that people feel very comfortable making when it comes to abortion. I realize that the two aren't exactly the same when it comes to theological importance here, but it's worth making that argument as well, that as public Catholics, they have a responsibility to at least listen carefully to what the church is saying, if not represent it themselves. So those are 2 very big things.
John?
Yeah, I think if the church wants to really, church leaders want to convince those who disagree politically on this issue, the best possible way is by making the church itself a model of welcome. And, if that's done on a local level, and if Catholics at the parish level understand that and implement it, that seems to me to be the best way to convince people that, that's not lecturing. That's showing what you do as a Christian. There's preaching too, and I wondered, listening to Archbishop Wensky, whether people in the pews ever heard that kind of analysis, because it would be good. But I think for the most part, it's the church acting, showing the world, really the nation to begin with, that it acts as a model of welcoming, which goes beyond just assisting in some ways, the the newly arrived or the undocumented. It goes beyond advocating for legislation.
Okay. The two of you who now agree want to make a joint statement?
I'm guessing we're going to have different recommendations, though. I would add, leaders continuing to speak up has been what the church has been doing, is incredibly powerful, and I have no doubt that church leadership will continue to speak up. I'd even say take a few tips from Bob, not all of them, a few tips from Bob. I think connecting with people's concerns and frustrations, because this issue is rather new to them, and they don't know it up close the way many parish priests do, quite frankly. But that's an opportunity to be generous rather than be preachy in how you communicate with them. But I would add to what the church could do citizenship drives, voter registration drives, and organizing efforts. Yes, at some point, the movable middle will shift to a more hospitable view towards immigration reform. But that's going to be aided greatly, quite frankly, by immigrants having such a larger presence in the political life of this country that politicians in both countries feel accountable to them in a way that they don't feel quite as accountable now.
Bob?
I actually have no brilliant practical suggestions. But I will point to one historical feature. Because I think the cultures it's not only American culture, but Western cultures in general are fragile right now. I mean, I'm actually surprised that the Vatican is not nervous about Islamization in Europe, because certainly the current leaders of France, Germany, and England are. This reflects something very deep in our culture right now. And about the only thing you can say that the church might be able to do is to provide a kind of space that makes it clear that we stand for something, that we have something that's worth defending, that people don't need to feel is so very fragile that the kinds of challenges that come from the outside are going to overthrow. But I have a little different view of this, I think, than some of the people in this room. I think that part of the problem is that some of our immigrants tend to mass in certain areas. And what happened in the past, this is my historical example, what happened in the past is the old city machines from Peggy's hometown of Chicago, as we're learning more and more about that city these days, the old political machines used to bind people to the American, the American experiment, so to speak, as did unions. And both of those old institutions, I don't think serve the same function. And we've just had this big national agony over unions in the Midwest and
In Wisconsin,
in
please.
Wisconsin. Is that
Not the whole Midwest.
perhaps not Illinois, but those secular institutions that used to exist to also help bind people together, all together in this country, new immigrants as well as old, bringing them together in practical ways, don't exist any longer. Is the church in its current condition with the abuse crisis and many other things that exist out there in a position to do anything more than those now largely gone institutions? I'm not sure. But it's worth trying, because I don't know who else is going to be able to do it at this point.
Okay, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you all for your patience, and thank the panel.